Hi, I'm Pastor Trip Kimball. I work with a group called Poyman Ministries, a group of pastors, veteran pastors, and we work with various pastors in various ways: coaching, mentoring, helping churches transition, assessments, things like that. Basically, our belief is that strengthening pastors will strengthen the church, and so that's our goal. I've been a missionary. I've planted a church. I've done just about anything and everything you can imagine with ministry, including physical work, janitor, leading worship, children's ministry, whatever. One of the things that I've found over the years is that there seems to be a missing link as far as helping people learn how to transition themselves out of certain roles into other roles. And so often there just is this cliff, and people either just burn out and they can't go on any further, or they come to a place and something new comes up and they want to go do that. And but there's a vacuum behind them. I've watched churches fail because the founding pastor moved on and put someone in who wasn't really ready, or there wasn't a transition that went smooth enough or long enough to get it to happen, so that it was fruitful and put the person in a place that they could do well. When I transitioned, I planted a church in Southern California, and when I was called to go to the Philippines with my wife and I and our family, I spent a year and a half preparing the church to transition. Now, I really didn't have a format or a plan or really so much of a strategy, except for what the Lord kind of gave me as I went along. Many years later, as I started working through the things I did in the Philippines, which was basically training pastors and then later on establishing a Bible college, I work a lot with inductive Bible study. And one of the texts that I use a lot is John 13, verses 1 through 17, the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. But the backstory is actually a little more important than oftentimes what people take out of that story. And the backstory is simply, Jesus knew that his time had come. It was the time of the Passover, and he was eating the Passover supper with his disciples. And after supper, before that, John primes us with, and this is found in John 13, verses 1 through 17. John helps us understand that Jesus knew that his time had come and that he would be returning to the Father. He'd come from the Father, he's going to return to the Father, and now he was going to show those who followed him and his people to the fullest extent of his love. And that's literally what the word means there when it says he'll love them to the end, and as it says in some versions. Now here's the point. Jesus knew that he was going to go to the cross. That was his mission. That was his primary mission. And he knew that his followers weren't really quite ready to take on everything that he was going to transfer to them. And yet, the time had come. And so we see in his 3.5 years of ministry, preparing them, all of that takes place, leading by example, delegating, and all of that. But finally, it comes to the last night before he's arrested and betrayed and then arrested. And so I want to share with you 5 ways that a true servant leader will transfer leadership. And I call it just simply the Jesus way, the Jesus style, however you want to describe it. It's what Jesus did. And we can see it right in the text of John 13. So if you want, you could open up a Bible, walk through John 13 with me. I'm not going to read it to you. This is a kind of a short format for me to do this. So I'm just going to relate it to you. But there's 5 different ways, and the first thing is you got to know the way. And so in verse 1 and 3, we're told by John what Jesus knew about himself, his mission, his purpose, and the timing of everything. And one of the things that I like to point out is that Jesus had nothing to lose. He knew who he was. And so he had absolutely nothing to lose. And one of the problems that I see with some teaching on leadership or books on leadership is to be confident, self-confident. And what I found is when I'm self-confident, then I end up relying on something that is fallible, that is something that where I can make mistakes. So the one thing that I need to learn to do is not be confident in myself so much, but be confident in the Lord and who he's made me to be, how he's gifted me, what he's called me to do. And so my confidence really is in the Lord. It's not in me, myself, and my abilities. It's my confidence is in the Lord. But how do we really know the way? Well, I find that to be the most simple, basic call of discipleship. Jesus said, if anyone, not just pastors or leaders, anyone wants to come after me, wants to follow me, wants to be one of my followers, they need to deny themselves, take up their cross, and then follow me. And here's how I break it down. Denying yourself is simply not giving in to your selfish nature. And the second thing is taking up the cross. We don't have a literal cross we take up. You know that. But what we do need to do is die to ourselves. And that's a lot harder to do. I found that marriage and parenting are pretty good ways of learning how to do that. But not everybody always gets that thing. But the main thing is as we follow Jesus, as we see him doing, as we follow him according to how he has called us to do, as Jesus pointed out to Peter after he restored him in John chapter 21, and Peter's concerned about how somebody else is following him. He says, what is that to you? You follow me. And that stuck with me over and over again as I've seen other pastors doing other things or other missionaries doing other things. And I say, Lord, how about me? And basically that's the message the Lord speaks to my heart over and over again. What is that to you? You follow me. Now the second thing we find in verses 4 through 5, and this is pretty easy, and that is you simply need to walk the way. In other words, be a living example. People need to be able to see how to follow Jesus by your life. I mean, it's so basic, I don't know that I need to spend much time on that, but we see that in Jesus. He takes off his outer clothing, which would be his rabbinical clothing, his robe, and he stoops down, he takes a pitcher of water, pours it into a basin, and he wraps a towel around his waist, and he goes around and washes the disciples' feet, and each one he takes off the towel and dries them and puts it back around him, and then he goes around. And so we see just this simple example of a servant leader. He knew who he was, they knew who he was, and that's why when we come to the third thing, so just leadership, being a living example, is an absolute essential. We see that with Paul as he discipled Timothy and Titus, and he told them, look, your example is the most important thing about your leadership. So that should be, in a sense, a given for most of us. So that leads us to the third thing, and that is we need to show the way. Now this is where I look at verses 6 through 13, if you will, in John 13. And primarily the dialogue between Peter and Jesus. So Peter sees Jesus going around washing the disciples' feet, the other disciples' feet. And even though they're all probably thinking the same thing, he blurts it out and he says, no, Lord, what are you doing? You're not going to wash my feet. And so they have Jesus and Peter have a back and forth with one another. And the first thing Jesus says to him is, Peter, you don't know what I'm doing now, but later you'll understand. But that still isn't good enough. And Peter continues to protest. And finally, Jesus says, Peter, unless I wash your feet, you will have no part with me. In other words, you will no longer be my follower and part of what I'm doing in my mission. Now, he's looking at it from the standpoint of Jesus being the Messiah, the ultimate leader. And Peter wants to stay there, and he's devoted to Jesus. We've seen that over and over again. He's devoted to Jesus. And so once Jesus frames it in that way, Peter, unless you allow me to wash your feet, you won't have any part with me. Then what does he do? He says, well, then, wash my head, my hands, my feet. Jesus says, no, that isn't needed. You're all clean. You just need your feet washed. He says, but not all of you are clean. And that's where he refers to Judas, who's going to betray him. Then after he finishes washing the disciples' feet, he takes his clothes, his outer garments, and puts them back on, and he sits down. That's the position of a teacher, a rabbinical teacher. He sits down and he begins to teach them in verse 13. So here's the thing about showing the way. It's just simply an extension of our example, but there are times when we need to dialogue with people and explain to them, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And that's a really, really important thing. You've heard the expression, it's not taught, you just got to, it's caught, it's not taught. Well, you can't just teach people, but at the same time, you can't just expect people to get what you get. Sometimes you see things and get things that others don't. And so we need to explain why we're doing things the way we're doing. And if you go back and you track through what Jesus does through the Gospels, you see this. He'll say one thing to the crowd, and then when he's in private, he explains things a little further to the disciples. And when they don't get it, he lays it on them, and he says, are you still so dull? Do you still not get this? And then there's times when he'll explain it further, or he just says the same thing again and expects them to process it and think it through. So that's an important thing. We're not talking about classroom or discipleship from the pulpit. We're talking about more of a relational discipleship process. It's a really, really important thing in terms of developing leaders. Now, a fourth thing is what I call making a way. And we see this in verses 14 through 15. Jesus begins to explain to them that what he told Peter before. You don't understand what I'm doing now, but later you will. And so he explains to them. He says, you call me Lord and teacher, and I am. So if I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, I want you to do the same thing. And then he uses another expression that would be familiar to them. The person that sent out with the message is not greater than the one who sends them out. The servant is not greater than the master, or the student is not greater than the teacher, that type of thing. But he emphasizes not only that role and relationship, but also the very action, the activity that they're going to do. And it's not about washing feet. If all you get out of John 13, 1 through 17 is to have a foot washing service, you're missing the major point. It is an example. It is a demonstration. And in this process, we see knowing the way, we've got to know the way. If we don't know the way, how's anybody going to follow us? The second thing is walking the way. They've got to see it in us. We can't just talk about stuff. They've got to be able to see that in us. And the third thing, showing the way, showing them how to do stuff and explaining why we do things. And then making a way. Now, what's making a way is basically, I believe that if you do discipleship well, which is intentional and relational, leaders will naturally develop from that. That's what I see with Jesus. Not everybody developed at the same level. It's what we see really with Paul and Timothy and Titus. How Paul speaks to Timothy is different than he spoke to Titus. Titus, it was a very short book, very simple, very direct, straightforward. With Timothy, Paul goes into much more detail. He encourages him a lot and writes 2 letters, as a matter of fact. So my sense is that Titus didn't need so much encouragement. He just, look at Titus, this is what you need to do, get it done. But with Timothy, there needed to be more encouragement. And that's part of the discernment that is required of us as leaders, is to understand what do people need. Some people need more attention than others, just like a parent to a child. Not all children are the same. You can't, although we raise them in the same home, we relate to them in different ways because they learn in different ways, and they have different ways of perceiving things and doing things, and they have different personalities and different characters and that sort of thing. So this is one of those things that I feel that we just don't do a good enough job of making a way. And one of the things that I see of making a way is creating opportunities for people to step up into leadership. Start small. Understand what are people's strengths, what are their weaknesses, or the things that they're not so strong in. Oftentimes I've found people want to do something that they're really not equipped to do. They're not gifted to do that. They're not even good at it. Now, sometimes you can help them move along in that, and that's fine. I mean, I've worked with people in discipleship, developing how to do things, how to teach, how to study, all those things. Not everybody's going to do it the same. Not everybody's going to do the same level. I found some people that I can just right away bring into a place of leadership, and others, it takes a long time and it's a long process to get them to that place. I've also found that some people are going to rise up to a certain level of leadership, and that's where they're going to stay. They don't have the capacity or the gifting or the calling to go beyond that. And that's part of what, for me as a leader, I need to discern that. I need to understand that. I can't just push someone into a place that they're not equipped or called to do. If I do that, I'm setting them up for failure, and I'm also setting myself up for failure too, and the church body or the ministry and the staff that I'm involved with. And so, really it just is a matter of creating opportunities, handing things off. I was a worship leader for many years. When I was pastoring, I had worship leaders, but there were times when, because of attitudes or problems in the worship leader's life, I had to have them sit down for a while, and I had to take up the guitar, because that's what I played, take up the guitar and lead worship again. I really didn't like leading worship and then teaching. And so oftentimes what I would do is I'd lead worship, and then I would have the church wait on the Lord for a while, which was basically my way of transitioning from leading worship to what I was going to share in my message. So that wasn't my favorite thing to do. So I would hand that off pretty quickly, pretty early on. When I established a Bible college in the Philippines, I had different young men working with me, and I would have them work as a TA, teacher assistant, as an intern, or I would start them out in a class. I would observe how they did. And so there were certain classes that I was confident that they could lead, and others I was maybe not so confident about that. And so I was careful with where I put them in. I want them to succeed. And I think that's a big part of making the way, is we want to put people in a place where they will succeed. And we need to create those opportunities. But part of that is learning how to hand things off and delegate in such a way that we're not hanging on to them as we hand them off. People know that. They understand. If you're handing something off, but you're not really letting go of it, they're going to keep coming back and say, well, how should I do this? How should I do that? Or is this okay? When I knew that God was calling us back to the U.S. from the Philippines, the Lord began to work in my heart. You need to prepare your staff for that eventuality. And so I began to do that. And one of the things I would start doing, it was just an example. I had basically 3 departments in our training center. One for the Bible college, one for inductive Bible study training, and then another one for our admin, and we handled short-term teams and did some missionary training. And so what I would do is I would have somebody over that, a department head. We didn't really call them that, but you get the idea, a leader of that area. And I would ask them to come up with a vision. What's their vision for where they want to go next with this area of ministry, or where we need to go next? But the other thing I would do is when they had decisions they need to make, I would first of all start them out with asking, well, what do you think? How do you think? Well, so then I would try to guide them towards making a decision, how to start working on developing a decision. And then the next time they come back in, I would go, well, what do you think? And they go, well, such and such. And they would tell me what their idea was. So then I would pose questions. Well, have you thought about this? No, I didn't think about that. Have you thought about this? Yeah, and this is what we'll do. And so as I could see that they're processing things and they're really understanding that they can't just make a decision without considering what the consequences are, or what the benefit is, or what the risks are, or whatever. As I began to see them, then I would just more and more back away from making those decisions. It's the same thing I did when I transitioned the church to leave the church in another pastor's hands. I did that work long before the pastor ever came. I worked with the board to make decisions on their own. I backed away from making those decisions. And so that's what leads me to the fifth step. And we see this is in verses 16 through 17. Now, the obvious and ultimate application is what we see Jesus say in verse 17. Now that you know these things, blessed are you if you do them. So it's not enough to know something, you got to do them. But here's the thing that I see about Jesus, and this is probably the most difficult thing for us as leaders, is knowing when the time comes to step away and to step back. So I'll give you a couple examples. So I gave you one example in terms of the transition of me being the founding pastor and preparing the body and the leadership in the body for that eventual transition. And then when I left. I didn't stay on the board. I didn't. Our church was at a growth point where we needed an assistant pastor. One that I had not done well, and he'd gone. But I intentionally decided that I would not bring in another person to be an assistant pastor. I would allow the new pastor to come in and raise up his own guy, because he is a different type of leader than I was. I knew he needed to have somebody that was going to work with him and would be his choice. And so I didn't do that. But we were right at that point. Well, as we began to transition out in the Philippines, the thing that I began to realize is I have to prepare this eventuality of handing things over. And so we did that, and all that worked fine. But I found that the most difficult thing for me was transitioning off of the field and back into the U.S. And looking back now, I can see what God was doing. But at the time, I didn't really understand it. I'm pretty much a type A personality, I guess. And so I'm used to getting in there and just doing things. And I was always a primary leader. Even if I started out at the bottom, eventually I'd get to the point where I'm the primary leader. And that was the thing the Lord was teaching me as I was growing older and I'd had X amount of experience and so on. Part of the major change that God wanted to do, and the part in me that was hard to deal with, was moving from a role of primary leadership to a role of secondary leadership. And it took a while. Honestly, it really took a while. And I struggled with it. There's times when I still struggle with it. But I knew that there was a point where I needed to get out of the way. And I'm thankful that I learned it early on, that I always need to be training someone up behind me, because I never know what the Lord's going to lead me on to do. Now, I've trained people up and then the Lord's moved them out, which at first I wasn't real happy with, because I thought, hey, I'm training these people up to help me. But I began to realize that is my responsibility. As I get older, I realize my primary responsibility is to train up younger generations. That's my responsibility. How I'm going to do that? Well, that's part of what I need to be open to what the Lord wants to do in my life and through me. And so I see Barnabas in Acts 11, where Barnabas sees this. He's sent to assess what's going on in Antioch and in this revival that's going on. And he realized this is the time, and he goes and gets Saul, whom we know as Paul, and he goes and he gets him, and he brings him back to Antioch because he knew the call that was on Saul, or Paul as we know him. He knew that he was called to be an apostle to the Gentiles. And so he goes and gets him and brings it back to Antioch, and well, as they say, the rest of its history, and we see that through the book of Acts and on into, from chapter 13 on, Barnabas and Paul are sent out, and then eventually Barnabas is no longer in the picture. Barnabas understood his role. He understood when it was time to step away and move away and let Paul move forward. And that's an important thing. There's times when, as a leader, the person who's going to come behind me is going to succeed me and do better. I've seen that with the church that I planted. And so I just want to encourage you in wrapping this all up. Look at, know the way, walk the way, show the way, make a way, and then finally step away, or if you want, get out of the way. And allow those that are younger, those that are being trained up, to move forward. And that is how the kingdom of God will move forward. That is how the church will continue to advance from generation to generation to generation. God bless you, and I hope this has been helpful in some way, and I'd be glad to talk with you more about it if you've got some questions and want to have some more feedback. All right, God bless.